Yeah, my dad was born on the 10th of April, 1916 in Tombstone, Arizona. And yes, it's the tombstone of Wyatt Earp legend and so forth. His father was a self-taught mining engineer. His mother had actually been born in Tombstone in 1881, which was the year of the OK Corral fight. So they lived there in Arizona. And he grew up in that small town all the way for the next 20 years, went to high school there, played sports, track and football, Eagle Scout, valedictorian of his little high school, but it was pretty rough. I mean, it got into the Depression. The mines there in Tombstone proper had ceased to operate. His father was really out mining on his own in Mexico and all throughout New Mexico and Arizona. And my father was aspiring to be a mining engineer. That's all he really wanted to do. But that was his growing up years. He started the University of Arizona, which was right up the road in Tucson, in 1934, and was a football player at 150 pounds. He was a rather good football player in those days in a small university of 2,500 people. And he also joined the Kappa Sigma fraternity, which was his opportunity to get a little more sophisticated, I think. It's interesting to note, despite his sort of humble life there in Tombstone, he did go to the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles, obviously as an observer. But he did attend those Olympics, which was unusual for a little guy from that small town. But that was his growing up. He started the University of Arizona. He did not complete in 4 years like we would today. He was stopping and starting and going back and mining with his father and elsewhere in order to earn money to continue to go to school. So he was still going to college in 1939. He had met his future wife, obviously my mother, who was from Tucson at that time and was also at the university. So he was there at the University of Arizona. It was a land grant college, by the way, and therefore he took 2 years of ROTC, but he was famously or infamously the worst cadet known to man because, again, he was only interested in being a mining engineer. But one day in the spring of 1939, his fraternity brothers said that the Air Corps recruiters were on campus and they were giving people physicals for possible entry into the Air Corps as cadets. And we have to remember that Roosevelt had started to expand the military as early as 1939. So he was taking men right out of college to become officers, and he was doing a lot of other things. But that was what this was about. So this group of Kappa Sig fraternity brothers all go over and take the physical, and the only guy that passes is Herb Macia, who was almost disinterested in going with him, but he said, yeah, I'll go along. And then he passed, and then he said, oh my gosh, well, there is probably a war coming, and I'd rather be in the Air Corps than the infantry. So he agreed to join the Air Corps as a cadet, but he asked to delay his entry a year. And that year was to go and do some more mining, which he did, and earned several $1,000s, which went to his family, and he may have bought a car with it also. But in any case, he entered the Air Corps as a cadet, nothing to do with ROTC, direct entry in June 1940. And he ended up being trained as a navigator. He was trained on the University of Miami campus by Pan American Airways guys, Pan American Airlines guys, who, of course, were adept at these long-distance flights. So he learned celestial navigation. And then I guess it was about the early spring of 1941, he was assigned to his first unit, which was the 17th Bomb Group. It was stationed at McCord Field, Washington State, Tacoma, Washington. But they, as again part of the defense buildup, they were already training at various locations around Washington and Oregon, and they were operating when he joined them at Pendleton, Oregon, at sort of like an austere field site to practice real operations away from a base. So he joined them there. He was basically still a cadet, still training for a few months. He was commissioned in June 1941 as a second lieutenant while in the unit. He was specifically assigned to the 89th Reconnaissance Squadron, which was one of the sub-elements of the 17th Bomb Group. And his squadron commander was a real old guy, about 29 years old, by the name of Jack Hilger, a major, who at that point would have been considered a real professional airman. He had graduated from Texas A&M in 1931, had been, I think, in the cavalry for a couple of years, like most of these guys, got into the Air Corps, and so he had several years, 8 or 9 years of service as an Air Corps officer. So there he was at Pendleton. I think they spent some time at McCord. I know he went on the North Carolina maneuvers with one of the crews, so they flew across the country and participated in these large-scale maneuvers that the administration was putting on, also as part of this defense expansion. And then in July 1941, he married my mother at Spokane, Washington. I believe around August 41, they began to receive the B-25 bombers. They had been flying an older type airplane up to that point. They began to get the B-25 and train with that and practice. It was a very modern airplane compared to the others. It took some time to get used to it, but they started that training there in the late summer of 41. They were at Pendleton on the 7th of December 1941 when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and literally were there. My parents, along with a guy named Tom Griffin, who was one of the Raiders also, and actually had been their best man at their wedding, and they were listening to records in their hotel they were staying in at Pendleton when this announcement was made. And of course, they immediately returned to base and waited for orders. I think the first thing they did that was operational was anti-submarine patrols along the Oregon and Washington coast, which were fairly routine operations, but they weren't sure what was going to happen, obviously. So my understanding, and I've read his oral history, was where I'm getting a lot of this, as well as a lot of notes that I found that he had left. I think around the 17th of February, the 17th Bomb Group was sent to Columbia, South Carolina as a unit to relocate, obviously getting ready to do some kind of operation. And when they got to Columbia, they called for volunteers for this unnamed mission. And the mission was not going to take the entire 17th group. So virtually the entire group volunteered, and as a result, the squadron commanders had to select who would actually participate. My dad went in to Hilger and volunteered to him, and Hilger basically said, "That's good because I've already selected you to go as my navigator." So they were there for a few days. They went down to Eglin Field, I think around the 1st of March, and they began the training. So the training was multifaceted. As a navigator, one of the things that looked like from the records I've seen, my dad was kind of collecting the records on the Norden bomb sites, which were not going to be used because they were highly classified. But other than that, the pilots, of course, were the main emphasis, and they had to learn to do the short runway takeoff. And there was a naval officer there that helped them. But as a crew, my dad and his crew flew a couple of practice missions that were from MacDill Field at Tampa, Florida, across the Gulf Coast and conducting a mock attack, say on, I guess, Houston or Galveston, somewhere along the coast, and then proceeding on to Kelly Field at San Antonio. So that flight across the Gulf was pretty realistic in terms of distance for the actual mission they were going to take. The flight after hitting the Texas coast onto Kelly was much, much shorter. But they did that a couple of times. They did bombing practice and so on. And toward the end of March, they were ordered to go to Alameda Naval Air Station near San Francisco. So one interesting little note about that is they flew west They would have been flying essentially along what is now Interstate 10 that runs from Houston roughly all the way across to Los Angeles. And as they flew across Arizona, they literally flew within about 20 miles of Tombstone. And my father says to Hilger and the crew on the intercom, look over there to the left, and you see those little hills? That's my hometown. And Hilger says, yeah, well, what's the name of that place? And Dad says, Tombstone. And Hilger says, oh, great. That's a great premonition for a highly high-risk mission that we were about to take on. So in any case, they went on to Alameda. I think they arrived the 31st of March, and like everybody else, they had stopped at Sacramento Air Corps Depot and had some work done on the planes. They then went on, and the planes were loaded up on USS Hornet CB-8, and they embarked on the 2nd of April. So where I'd like to start really is on the evening of the 17th. They'd been on board the ship for quite a while now, a couple of weeks. Really rough seas coming out of San Francisco until they linked up with the Enterprise Task Force coming out of Hawaii. And the seas smoothed out a little bit, but they continued on. The night of the 17th, my dad has a little notebook, and he kind of recorded what he was doing that night. He went up to, first of all, they had their evening meal, and the Navy announced that general quarters would not be sounded as a precaution. They'd been sounding general quarters at sunset and sunrise throughout the voyage to get the crew prepared for anything. And they reported, okay, we're close to the objective, and therefore the next general quarters you hear will be the actual launch for the mission. However, on the night of the 17th, they still expected to depart 24 hours later, the evening of the 18th. But they had everything loaded on the airplane, their equipment, bombs, obviously, ammunition, all that were loaded up. He went up to what was called Admiral's Country, which was a wardroom area on the ship. A lot of the officers were sleeping in there, and he just reported that they were a lot more somber than they had been, a lot less joking around. He played a game of checkers with Tom Griffin, and then he went to bed. And I think it was about 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. that general quarters was sounded the next morning. And what was, of course, the surprise was they were going to launch immediately. And that was a little bit of helter-skelter as they got some of their personal gear, the rest of their personal gear, and extra fuel cans loaded on the aircraft and got ready to go. So let me take a break. What I forgot to mention, Bill, and I guess you can edit this, is the first thing that was known to them about the mission was around, I think, the 2nd of April, after they left San Francisco, and that's when they were told what the mission would be. And soon after that, they had the famous photograph of Doolittle pinning the naval officers' medals on a bomb to return those to Japan. And that was a picture of the entire contingent, which is fairly famous. Okay, so we're back now the morning of the 18th of April, and they're crew number 14. So they're the third from the last airplane on the Hornet. And they've got to watch, a whole series starting with Doolittle at about 8:25 launching. The launching was, from the records I've read, and the Navy log is available, was very, very efficient. They were launching about every 3 minutes. Very rough seas. The deck was pitching violently, but I think they had something like a combined headwind, both natural wind and the ship's speed. They had something like a 65 mile an hour headwind. So that's one of the main reasons that all the planes lifted off very successfully. It's interesting to note, though, in the Navy After Action Review report, the written report, they say that all but one of the Army airplanes did a miserable job taking off. So not up to Navy standards, but it was their first attempt. So anyway, they take off around 9:15. Two other planes after them are the last two. They're supposed to fly as a flight of three. And they're flying first to essentially to Tokyo, but before entering Tokyo Bay, they would turn south to the left and go about another hour to Nagoya, because their target was Nagoya. Aircraft 15's target was Kobe, which is near Nagoya, and 16's target was in that same area. So they were supposed to fly together. In reading the various accounts, both my dad's plane 14 and 15 were within sight of each other throughout the flight. They never did see flight 6 or aircraft 16 throughout the flight. They went about 3.5 hours to reach the landfall of Japan. Soon after they left the carrier, I think around 30 minutes, they were in absolutely clear, beautiful weather. They were flying at wave top level, but weather was not a problem. I think they saw one Japanese airplane going out to sea. It didn't apparently see them, and they were on their way. So they found their landmark outside of Tokyo Bay. They turned south short of the coast of Japan, and they paralleled the coast going south, kind of checking landmarks as they went. About an hour further on, they come to the Nagoya area, and they turn inland. There was an inlet, a waterway that was their landmark. They turned inland, and they flew basically north along an opposite course and path to which they were going to bomb. And when I think about this, and I'm sure later in World War II, my dad would have thought that was crazy. They were flying right along the path that they were going to bomb. They were offset by a number of miles, but they were obviously going to be observed by the people on the ground. And then they did a 180 turn and went back the other direction, flying south, and they climbed to about 1,500 feet. They were flying still up to that point at treetop level. So as they climbed to 1,500 feet, they started to receive anti-aircraft fire, which was heavy but inaccurate. And of course, hard for them to measure. They'd never been fired at in their lives. In fact, their gunner, Staff Sergeant Bain, was indignant and kind of said to Hilger over the intercom, "Hey, sir, they're shooting at us. Those guys on the ground are shooting at us." Yeah, right. Okay. So they made the 180 degree turn. They had 4 targets. My dad, in his immediate interview in Chongqing, said it was extremely hard to pick up the targets. The maps that they had been given were too small, too large a scale, I guess, and did not allow them to pinpoint targets very easily. But the first target was a barracks complex around Nagoya Castle. And Nagoya Castle was an ancient structure and was fairly visible. It was a high building. So they dropped their first bomb there on the barracks. They immediately came upon their second target, which was a petroleum storage warehouse. They'd hit that. They then had to adjust their course slightly to the left, and they hit their third target, which was the arsenal. And then they had to steer right again and go quite a distance back down to Nagoya Bay, and they hit the Mitsubishi aircraft factory. Just one bomb on each, and they hit all their targets. They then dropped down to sea level, and it's interesting to note that they actually tried to observe a couple of additional designated targets, and a petroleum field and an airfield, just to write intelligence about that. Obviously thinking that this would be useful. I think the crews were all told, record everything you can. You have to remember, it was going to be 2 years, almost to the day, before the U.S. would bomb Japan again. So that was pretty irrelevant intelligence. But anyway, they dropped down to sea level again in Nagoya Bay. They flew out to sea about 20 miles, and to give the impression they were going back to a ship, and then they turned south toward China. Reading the Reading the accounts of Crew 15 and 16, it's interesting to note that number 15, as I said, was with them the entire time. And when they turned right on up the inlet flying north, then Crew 15 went directly to Kobe and hit their targets. Crew 16 was coming along behind them, and it did see them and actually saw my dad's plane as it was leaving Nagoya and was descending back down to wave top level. But they did observe them, and they flew across their path behind them and decided to bomb, I think, the same Mitsubishi plant there in Nagoya, and then proceeded on. So now the three planes have all headed south. My dad's plane in the lead, 15 behind and 16 behind them. Not necessarily that aware of each other. They're flying south. They got past the southern tip of Japan. They observed a naval flotilla. I think they may have been fired upon. They certainly were not going to try to return fire, and they were trying to get to China. They flew some kind of pattern to determine wind, and I'm not sure what that was, but it gave them the idea that they had a very significant tailwind, which was encouraging, because up to this point, they felt they were probably never going to get to China, given the extra distance from the early takeoff. But they determined they had a good tailwind, and they felt they would make China. So they're flying on about halfway to China, about 200 miles from the coast. They run into weather again. They climb, and they go on instruments. And as they did that, aircraft 15 behind them decided to divert to the right, farther north. And then aircraft 16, the last one, saw the other two planes diverge and went right between them. So very quickly, what happened to 15, of course, is it ditched up on the Chinese coast. That aircraft had the doctor on board, and they eventually linked up with crew number 7, and the doctor was instrumental. Dr. White was instrumental in saving the lives of some of the very severely injured crew members on number 7. Number 16 continued to fly inland and flew to the extent of its fuel, and was the airplane that actually flew the farthest west. Unfortunately, when they bailed out, that entire crew was captured that same night, and it was not a good story for them. So back to Crew 14. They're approaching the coast. They know their mountains. The recommendation, my dad's is the navigator, so he's recommending things to do with regard to flight, is to climb. They climb to 7,000 feet to clear coastal mountains. After a period of time, they feel like they might want to try to climb up above the clouds and get a celestial sight so they can determine their location. They start to do that. It uses too much fuel. They abandon that idea. And by then, my dad is saying, I think we've actually reached our destination airfield of Lishu. They had crossed the coast at about 5 p.m. It was now getting pretty dark. Lishu is fairly well inland past the mountains, but he felt they had reached that, and they had to make a decision. Okay, so they feel like they've reached their destination airfield. They're not getting any radio signals that they expected. They're in heavy weather on instruments still, and they have three choices. They can either try to descend and land at Lishu. They can continue to fly, as it turned out that Crew 16 had done, or they can bail out. So descending didn't seem like a good idea. Very, very rudimentary instruments, mountainous terrain, bad weather. It may be all the way to the ground. The weather may be all the way to the ground, so they abort the idea of going down. If they want to continue to fly west, they know that Japanese occupied territory is to the west. There's also the Poyang Lake complex, and they didn't want to try to bail out above that lake complex. So Hilger makes the decision to bail out, and that's about 75 miles west of Lisieux. And it's always surprised me that they were able to bail out very rapidly, having never bailed out of an airplane, none of them. And with Sergeant Bain in the back of the aircraft, isolated from the rest of the crew. Of course, they're on intercom, but he had to jump first, followed by Staff Sergeant Ironman, the engineer who went out of the hatch kind of below the cockpit, followed by my father, followed by Lieutenant Jack Sims, the co-pilot, and last Major Hilger, the commander. And that's the protocol, by the way, is the junior guy goes first, the commander goes last. So as it turned out, Bain was a little bit farther from the rest of the group. Ironman, my dad, and Sims were actually very close to each other when they landed, although they didn't know it. And then Major Hilger was a little bit farther because he had to put the aircraft on automatic pilot, and he had to get out and crawl down and bail out. So my dad's one and only parachute jump. They're using a chest parachute with a ripcord. They've each got a little musette bag, a little pack, kind of like a backpack we'd see today. But they didn't really realize how to use that. My dad put it over his right shoulder and put the strap under the lapel on his flight jacket. So when he went out, as people are prone to do, he immediately pulled the ripcord. What happens when you do that is the prop blast inflates your parachute, and it feels like you're hitting a stone wall. He then is oscillating back and forth. It's very typical also. And then he's spinning after he finishes oscillating. So he finally comes out of all that, and he's descending. His first feeling is typical of people that do military parachuting, is that plane is going away. That safe haven, that airplane I've been in for 13 hours and 2,000 miles, and I've heard that engine drumming, is leaving me, and I'm out here by myself. He'd also lost his musette bag. It had been torn loose. It had his rations, also some whiskey, other supplies in it. It was gone. But he was descending. He was in white clouds. As he described it, he said, I wasn't sure I was falling. And in these white clouds, you don't have a sense of falling. Finally looks down, and he sees a black hole in the clouds, and the next thing he knows, that's the top of a mountain, and he hits and lands pretty violently, and he's rolling down the mountain. His parachute gets caught up in some little pine trees, so he stopped by that. He crawls up to the parachute, and he gets on his feet, and he climbs at the top of the mountain. Middle of the night, he knew enough growing up in Arizona, being a miner, you don't walk around in the middle of the night in mountains or you'll step off the side of one. So he basically just hunkers down. It's, I think, about 40 degrees, raining on and off. He said, when the rain stopped, it was actually worse. The breeze would come up, and he did the best he could just to stay there and get through the night. So next morning, and that was about, I think, 9:30. The next morning, as light starts to come up, he looks around and sees that he's in a very picturesque setting. Down in a valley below him are rice paddies, some houses with smoke coming out of chimneys, some little trails. Okay, so he's got to figure out, where do I go? He starts down the mountain, passes a couple of people. They act like they don't see him. He comes to a house. They've been given a little phrase in Chinese, I'm an American soldier. He knocks on the door. A fellow opens the door. He says the phrase. The guy has a totally frightened look on his face, slams the door, bolts it shut, and won't open the door again to his knocking. So there you are. He starts walking down the trail, heading somewhere down this valley. He's really not sure which way he's going. All the people he passes ignore him, won't look at him. Probably had never seen an Occidental before in their lives. He finally comes to a field, and there's some people working in the field in I guess, a rice paddy. And one of those guys, a younger man, kind of looks at him. from a distance and acknowledges him, and he waves to the guy, and he comes, the Chinese man comes up to him, and in an expression on his face, he says, well, you know, what happened to you? He points at the torn jacket, and my dad pulls out his little book and tries a number of phrases and tries to draw a picture of an airplane with a parachute coming out of it. The guy doesn't really understand him, but starts to lead him along this road. And they go through a number of villages, and every time they come to a village, this guy calls the villagers together and kind of says, hey, look at this guy that I've got. He's very interesting. He's not like us. I don't know anything about him. I can't talk to him. But isn't he interesting? And they continue. And they finally come to a more of a village. And they go into one of the houses, stone house, very, very crude. And they seem to be waiting for somebody. And the Chinese villagers are looking in the windows. Some are in the house. And of course, you got to remember, the crew wasn't quite sure whether they were in Japanese occupied territory or not. The airfield they were supposed to land in was not, but they weren't really sure where they were. So he's getting nervous about maybe I'm about to be captured. You know, they're waiting for somebody. Turned out they were waiting for sort of the village scholar. This elderly guy comes. I can imagine what he was. My dad says he has a long beard, so I'm imagining this sort of a Mandarin-looking guy. And that man sits down and orders tea to be served and writes out a message on he's got a notebook and a pen. He writes out a message in Chinese. He shows it to my father. My father, says, no comprendo. So all the people laugh, and, this guy's a loser. He doesn't understand what our scholar is so capable of writing, and he can't understand it. My dad tries the same thing and shows it to the scholar, and he doesn't understand anything either. So they're sitting there sort of in a friendly environment, drinking tea. My dad tries to get them to dry his socks, by the way. And this is a story I found that he actually wrote when he was in North Africa later in the war. He tries to get them to dry his shoes and socks. And what they do is they wash his shoes and socks and bring them back to him. And so that's that. He then decides, after a while drinking tea, I've got to get going. I can't sit here, And he gets up. They're trying to get him to stay. He finally gets up. I'm going, and he walks out. And the original little the young guy who had escorted him goes with him and continues to lead him along. And now I think this guy feels this is somebody important. So they come to a rock in the road, and this guy's helping my dad, step over it, and he's being very conciliatory and very nice to him. And they finally come through another mountain pass down a valley to a road, and they see it's a road he sees that it's a road that's been used by motor vehicles, and he also sees there's a telephone line along that road. So they follow that, and they come to a building that he thinks is like a bus station out in the country. And he goes in, and there is a telephone. He gets on the telephone. Nothing works. I mean, it works, but everybody on the line is Chinese, so that he can't do anything. So he's there, kind of thinking, what am I going to do next? Another group of Chinese show up, and there's sort of a guy in charge. They're all civilians still, and the guy in charge orders the young Chinese man, go back to your village. You're finished with this job. So they're there in this building and still kind of waiting. What are we going to do? And suddenly Sergeant Eierman walks up to the same building, and that's the engineer off his crew, and the guy that had jumped right ahead of him. So hey, they're very glad to see each other. They talk about, I think, a little bit about what has happened, but they immediately then start off in some direction, led by this new Chinese authority. And they're put in these sedan chairs. They call them rickshaws, but they're really, when you look at the pictures, they're being carried by Chinese guys, and they're covered straw chairs. And they, again, go through a series of villages, and every time they come to a village, they uncover these two Americans and kind of show them off to the village, and look at these guys, and they continue on. But after a while, they get the impression, hey, maybe we're being turned in to the Japanese. We're being carried along. They come upon some paramilitary people who are armed, but they're not in uniform. So that's okay, because they were told on the ship that the Chinese were not likely to be in uniform, so that the idea of paramilitary was okay. And they continue on. They come to a covered bridge. They get up. They get out of the chairs. They're talking to each other, and they're sharing their suspicions that they're maybe being carried to the Japanese. And then they look up and across from this bridge, and they see a truck coming, and the truck is loaded with military in uniform. And they suddenly say, "Oh my gosh, we're going to be turned in." So my dad, it's probably the only flamboyant thing he ever did in World War II. He says to Ironman, "Well, one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to shoot this guy that's been leading us, and then I'm going to run as best I can." And as they're about to do that, the truck stops, it unloads. It's kind of obviously a military unit. There appears to be a junior officer in charge. He lines these guys up, and they start double timing toward the Americans. And suddenly the lieutenant in charge says, "Americans, we're your friends. We have your crew member, we have your leader with us." And they sort of are taken aback, and then they see in the back of the truck, there's Hilger. Major Hilger's in the truck. So they join this group. They feel, hey, we've made it. And these guys are, it turns out, part of something called the 15th Regiment Gendarmerie. Just like in France, they're kind of National Guard guys, but they're full military guys. And they're the militia, if you will, in Jiangxi province where they're located. So to get in the truck, they're on their way to the town of Guangfeng, which is the province, the county seat within this province. And as they're on their way there, they actually come across Lieutenant Sims and pick him up. So they all get to the village of Guangfeng that evening. And there are some young men that can speak English, actually speak English and not say some words that they don't really understand. So they're feeling pretty comfortable. That the mayor of the town is there. A school teacher is brought in who is fluent in English. They're taken up to a bedroom in a warehouse, above a warehouse, and there's a picture taken, pretty famous picture, as well as one of them, minus Sergeant Bain now, he hasn't arrived yet, walking down the street in Guangfeng, and it's a ancient town with walls and cobblestone streets and the like, and so they feel pretty good, but they're still not home free. That night, about 10 o'clock, Sergeant Bain arrives, so they're all together and they feel pretty good. They still don't eat anything. The only thing they're eating is hard-boiled eggs, because they've been warned not to eat anything to avoid illness. So the next morning, so that's the 19th of April.